All CANiK M2 heavy machine guns must be inspected and measured with all gauges at least once a year for safety and serviceability. It is essential that operational procedures for the machine gun be followed before installing on a mount. Assembly, disassembly, cleaning, maintenance or operations on the platform without knowledge of all safety precautions to be followed on the M2 may cause injury or death to personnel. Do not carry out these operations without first disconnecting the feed paths of the weapon and ensuring that the chamber is empty. To avoid injury to your eyes, be careful when installing and removing spring-loaded parts. Always wear protective eyewear. Gauge headspace and timing. Open the top cover. Pull the retracting slide. Lift the cartridge extractor and pull the retracting slide back slightly. Try to completely insert the no-go end of the gauge into the T-slot. Make sure that the no-go end does not pass through. Then, try to place the go end of the gauge into the T-slot completely. The go surface of the gauge should enter the T-slot freely. Timing. Open the top cover. Cock the weapon by pulling the retracting slide. Retract the mechanism with the retracting slide slightly and insert the no-fire gauge into the gap between the trunnion block and the barrel extension. Release the retracting slide slowly and squeeze the trigger. Make sure that the trigger does not squeeze. Retract the retracting slide slightly and insert the fire gauge and squeeze the trigger. Make sure that the trigger squeezes. If the trigger squeezes, the firing time setting is appropriate. Firing pin protrusion gauge. Cock the firing pin. Ensure cocking lever is in the rearward position. Release the sear. Check firing pin protrusion through the face of the mechanism with the go and no-go ends of the gauge. Ensure that the gauge passes through the mechanism surface with the go end and it does not pass through with the no-go end. Plug gauge firing pin hole. Cock the firing pin. Check the firing pin hole in the bolt using a plug gauge. Ensure that the gauge tip enters the hole gently but firmly and does not go all the way through. Stripping assembly of the buffer. Remove buffer assembly from barrel buffer body. Place buffer assembly in oil buffer tool assembly, with buffer assembly mating with tool assembly latch. Squeeze buffer guide and spring together. Turn knob 1/4 turn to release buffer guide from buffer assembly. Remove spring from buffer body and guide. Position buffer guide, spring, and buffer assembly in oil buffer tool assembly. Compress spring using handle. Turn knob 1/4 turn to lock buffer guide to buffer assembly. Release handle and remove assembled buffer assembly from oil buffer tool assembly. Gauge for barrel support. Insert the gauge into the barrel support part front hole. Ensure that it sits on the inner surface of the hole and turns gently but firmly. Bushing brass threaded plug special gauge. Insert the gauge into the barrel support part rear hole. Ensure that it sits on the inner surface of the hole and turns gently but firmly. Gauge breech bore. Insert the gauge into the chamber of the barrel separated from the machine gun. Slide the tapered part of the gauge forwards until it contacts with the groove sets and read the rings where the gauge fits. Ensure that it does not reach the red line, which indicates the end of the service life reference. Gauge bore erosion. Before use, place the calibration tool into the calibration slot on the gauge. Push the rod forward, ensuring that it does not pass the reject line. Use of bore erosion gauge. Set the gauge to the HB position. Retract the rod and insert the gauge into the chamber. Push the rod gently, but firmly, into the gauge tube until it is stopped by the collet engaging the bore. Check from the rod at the back of the gauge tube to ensure that it does not reach the reject line. To measure the wear rate of the barrel rifling marks, move the gauge to the reverse position. Retract the rod and drive it into the barrel carefully. Place the gauge in the chamber. Push the rod forward. Make sure that it does not reach the reject line. Reflector gun barrel. Insert the reflector gun barrel to the chamber in the barrel separate from the machine gun. The wear and tingling conditions of the grooves and sets are detected by the equipment. Gauge front frame hole. The front connection holes of the machine gun are checked with a gauge. It should be checked that the go end passes and the no-go end doesn't. Gauge rear frame hole. The rear connection holes of the machine gun are checked with a gauge. It should be checked that the go end passes and the no-go end doesn't. Gauge buffer, recoil mechanism. Mechanism stop buffer length located on the back plate is checked with a gauge. Ensure that the gauge passes through the back plate surface without being obstructed by the buffer. Back plate adjustment wrench. The back plate disc plug is used for assembly and disassembly processes. The torque value is set to 30 foot-pounds. During assembly, use a torque wrench to tighten it, ensuring that the torque value is based on 30 foot-pounds. Combined key set. It is used to remove the back plate assembly handle screws. Control the buffer length. Remove the plug on the back plate assembly. and remove the nuts on the body surface. Firing pin attachment. Fix the firing pin extension to the clamp. Place the attachment onto the firing pin extension's end, and press the lever inward. Remove the pin. Take the springs in the firing pin extension out from the body by pulling the attachment back. Rod gauge oil buffer. Check the length of the unsprung buffer assembly by aligning it with the no-go side of the gauge. Make sure that it does not pass. Then check with the go side of the gauge and make sure that it passes. Tool assembly bolt latch. Remove the barrel extension, buffer assembly, bolt assembly, and back plate assembly, and pass the latch through the back plate grooves on the empty receiver. Put the spring under pressure by turning the operating lever clockwise. Remove the cotter pin at the end of the bolt latch spring. Install a wrench to the nut on the spring and turn it counterclockwise. Remove the spring and latch. Remove the bolt latch spring from the receiver. Legal warning. All rights of the works prepared by SYS Group Company are reserved. The entire parts of the works may not be reproduced, copied, published, distributed by any means, including photocopying, without the prior authorization of SYS Group Company. Either as text or visual material, excluding short quotations to be made for promotion by indicating the source, cannot be transmitted to the public, rented, sub-licensed, used for any other purpose, including commercial purposes. Amending or altering the entire or parts of the works, incorporating thereof within any compilations, rendering thereof available and convenient for disclosing to public by means of devices for transmission of signs, audio and video, including the storage in voice recording devices, translation thereof to a foreign language, and all sorts of similar uses thereof require written authorization of SYS Group Company.